In the quiet town of Crestwood, where everyone knew each other and life moved in rhythm with the seasons, Daniel Hale's arrival set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. Daniel, who had just returned from the city, with his striking eyes and youthful charm, stirred a ripple in the town's calm waters. At only 28, he carried an effortless beauty, soft brown hair that caught the sunlight, an athletic frame honed by years of running, and a confidence that made him seem older. But the real disruption came when he crossed paths with Dr. Theodore Porter, the town's beloved physician at 50. Theodore had built a life defined by routine and success. His sharp silver hair and broad shoulders exuded authority, while his deep-set eyes hinted at depths of passion long restrained. What began as a simple visit to the clinic for Daniel soon spiraled into something far more dangerous, igniting a secret that neither man could have ever foreseen. Dr. Theodore Porter had been a part of Crestwood for nearly 3 decades. He was now in his early 50s. If anyone were to describe him, they'd say he'd aged gracefully. He was tall and broad-shouldered with a full head of silver streak hair. Theodore had an air of authority that came naturally to him. His eyes were sharp and deep-set, and his strong jawline marked with a few lines of wisdom added to his charisma. He never sought attention for his looks. People always noticed Theodore. He was a dedicated physician, well-respected and trusted by the townspeople. Theodore's domain was Crestwood's only clinic, a modest but well-equipped place. He had built his practice over the years, establishing deep relationships with his patients. But lately, as he approached his 50s, the pull of routine had begun to wear on him. The same faces, the same ailments. Nothing ever changed in Crestwood except for one thing: a young man named Daniel. Daniel was new to town. He had just returned from the city after completing his studies at 28. He was full of energy, ambition, and an eagerness to build a life for himself. His parents had grown up in Crestwood, but they had left when he was a child, seeking better opportunities in the city. Now, with a fresh degree in environmental studies, Daniel had chosen to return to Crestwood to get away from the noise and bustle of city life. It wasn't long after he moved back that he found himself sitting in Dr. Porter's waiting room. He hadn't been feeling well for a few days, just a cold, but it was enough to make him feel off. Crestwood only had one doctor, so he had no choice but to visit Dr. Porter. He had heard nothing but praise for the man. When Daniel was called into the examination room, the first thing he noticed was how impressive Dr. Porter looked up close. He'd expected a man who looked older, perhaps tired, but what he saw instead was a man who exuded strength and vitality, even in his 50s. Theodore, on the other hand, was used to seeing new faces occasionally, but something about Daniel was different. There was a vibrancy to him, a spark that Theodore couldn't quite place. It wasn't just that Daniel was good-looking. Though that was hard to ignore, it was the way he carried himself, confident yet with a hint of vulnerability. "How long have you been feeling like this?" Theodore asked, his voice calm and professional as he leaned in to examine Daniel. "Just a few days," Daniel replied, though his mind was already distracted. He felt a strange warmth in the room and an unexpected connection forming between him and the older man standing before him. Theodore's touch was gentle but firm as he checked Daniel's vitals. Daniel found himself momentarily mesmerized. The doctor's hands were strong and capable, years of experience visible in them. Theodore had always kept a professional distance with his patients, but there was something about this young man that made him feel something he hadn't in years. He noticed the way Daniel's shirt clung to his shoulders and how his green eyes seemed to search Theodore's as if waiting for more than a diagnosis. "It's just a mild flu," he finally said, stepping back. "You'll be fine in a few days with some rest and medication, thanks document," Daniel said, flashing a smile that could have lit up the entire room. That smile lingered with Theodore long after Daniel had left the clinic. He found himself thinking about it later that evening as he sat at home. His mind wandered to the way Daniel had looked at him, the ease with which they had spoken. He told himself it was nothing, just a patient like any other. But deep down, he knew something had shifted. Daniel too couldn't shake it. Over the next few weeks, Daniel found reasons to visit the clinic. A mild cough here, a checkup there, small things that most people would have brushed off. But he used them as reasons to see Theodore again. Each visit was the same, brief moments of conversation, shared glances, and an undeniable tension that neither of them acknowledged but both felt. But no one knew what was yet to come. The town began to notice the friendship that was forming between the two. It wasn't unusual for Theodore to take an interest in younger people. He mentored a few, but there was something different about the way he and Daniel interacted. The older women who worked at the clinic began to whisper, though they couldn't quite put their finger on it. To them, it looked like an innocent friendship, a doctor helping a young man settle into town. But they didn't see the moments behind closed doors, the lingering stares or the accidental brushes of hands that sparks flew between the two men. It was during one of these routine visits that things changed for good. Daniel had come in for a follow-up, even though there was nothing wrong with him. He sat in the examination room waiting for Theodore, as he had done several times before. When Theodore entered, there was an odd silence between them. It was as if they both knew something was about to happen, but neither wanted to be the one to make the first move. "Daniel, you're perfectly healthy," Theodore said with a small smile, sensing the absurdity. "How often have you been coming in?" "I don't know. I don't know. I guess I've been feeling a little off lately." Theodore walked to the door, quietly turned the lock, and faced Daniel. He stared for a long moment, his sharp eyes scanning Daniel's face, searching for the truth hidden behind his silence. Daniel hesitated, unsure if he should say what was on his mind. There was something about Theodore, something steady and safe, that made him want to. "I don't know. I guess I've just been feeling alone since I moved here. It's harder than I thought it would be coming back to a place where I don't know anyone." Theodore nodded, understanding in his expression. It can be hard adjusting to a new life. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the air between them seemed to shift. Daniel's pulse quickened, and he noticed the way Theodore's gaze lingered on him just a second too long. It was the first time either of them had allowed the tension between them to come to the surface, and neither was sure what to do next. "You're not alone," Theodore said. His voice was softer now, almost a whisper. "You have me." It was a simple statement, but it was enough to break the dam that had been building between them in a moment of impulsive need. Daniel leaned forward and kissed Theodore. It was quick, hesitant, but full of the longing that had been building over weeks of unspoken feelings. Theodore pulled back, stunned. They stood there for a moment, catching their breath. Daniel and Theodore began to speak, but they were both a bit shaken up. Daniel said he was sorry, but Theodore was quick to apologize, too. He was embarrassed and said he shouldn't have done it. Before Theodore could say anything more, Daniel turned and left. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Theodore was left standing in the empty room, thinking. He realized he should have stopped it. He should have told Daniel it was wrong. They couldn't tell the truth, though. In fact, he didn't want to. But the story didn't end there. In the months that followed their first kiss, Theodore and Daniel's affair began to grow. It was exciting for them both, at least at first. The two men became intertwined in ways neither could have predicted. Theodore, with his years of experience, remained confident. He kept his calm exterior while Daniel, youthful and eager, threw himself into it. The relationship grew more intense. Their meetings became a regular thing after work. Theodore would send Daniel a quick message, something simple like "tonight," and Daniel would reply with a location they met in remote corners of Crestwood. These were places where no one would suspect a thing. The woods beyond the town had long been a haven for those seeking solace, but for Theodore and Daniel, it became the perfect hiding spot. It was a place where they could shed their respectable facades and indulge in the secret that bound them together. Theodore, these moments were a break from reality. He'd spent decades in control of his life, always doing the right thing and following the path expected of him. But with Daniel, things were different. Theodore found himself more daring and willing to take risks. He never would have before. There was something thrilling about sneaking around and the stolen kisses in darkened places. There was also something thrilling about keeping this part of his life hidden from the world and Daniel. Daniel was intoxicated by it all. He loved being with a man like Theodore, who was older. And he felt more powerful, like he had a sense of purpose he'd never had before. He'd spent his life searching for something to hold on to, and he thought he'd found it with Theodore. Every meeting in the woods, every secret glance across a crowded room, made Daniel's feelings for Theodore grow stronger. What had begun as a simple physical attraction had turned into something more dangerous and intense. The affair wasn't just exciting for Daniel, it was everything he had. Daniel was the only one in Crestwood with a meaningful relationship. His life revolved around Theodore. At first, it was innocent. Daniel simply craved more time with him. He eagerly waited for Theodore's messages, feeling a jolt of excitement every time his phone buzzed. But as time went on, Daniel wanted more than just these stolen moments. He wanted all of Theodore in public. They kept their distance. Theodore was careful. He had to be. Crestwood was a small town, and everyone knew each other. If anyone found out what was going on, it would ruin his reputation. He'd built his career and his life on respectability, and he wasn't about to let that be taken away. So when they saw each other outside of their private meetings, they were nothing more than acquaintances. He kept his interactions with Daniel brief, always careful to appear professional. Daniel didn't care about discretion anymore. His feelings for Theodore had gone beyond mere desire. Daniel was in love with Theodore. He'd convinced himself that he was in love with him, and that love was deep and undeniable. Daniel was desperate for more. He wanted to be in Theodore's life, every part of it. He started showing up at Theodore's clinic unexpectedly, under the pretense of needing medical advice. At first, Theodore played along and indulged him. Daniel was coming by because he didn't want to hurt Theodore, but as Daniel's visits became more frequent, Theodore started to feel uneasy. "You can't just show up like this," Theodore warned him one evening after Daniel had dropped by his house unannounced. They were in Theodore's living room, the curtains drawn tightly to keep the rest of the world out. "People are going to start noticing," Theodore said. "I don't care if they notice," Daniel replied, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'm tired of hiding. I want to be with you all the time. Why can't we just be together?" Theodore interrupted him. His voice was stronger than he intended. He knew why this couldn't be public. Daniel's face fell, but he whispered, "I love you." The words hung in the air. Theodore didn't know how to respond. He cared for Daniel. He had enjoyed their time together. He felt a sense of responsibility. The younger man, but love that was something Theodore couldn't offer. The relationship had never been about love for him. It had been about passion and escape. Now, seeing the raw vulnerability in Daniel's eyes, Theodore realized just how deep Daniel had fallen and how far he had fallen short of Daniel's expectations. "I can't give you what you want," Theodore said softly. "I'm sorry, Daniel, but this was never supposed to be anything more than this." Daniel stared at him, his green eyes wide with disbelief. Daniel's eyes widened in disbelief. "So that's it? You're just going to keep me hidden away like some dirty little secret?" Theodore didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was already there, plain for Daniel to see. After that conversation, things began to spiral out of control. Daniel became more possessive and more desperate. He started showing up at Theodore's house without warning, even in the middle of the night, banging on the door until Theodore let him in. Daniel's messages became more and more urgent. He'd flood Theodore with questions. "Where are you? Why aren't you answering? Are you with someone else?" Theodore, who'd once been drawn to Daniel's intensity, now found it overwhelming. He tried to create distance between them to end things gently, but Daniel wouldn't let him. The more Theodore pulled away, the tighter Daniel clung. One night, standing in the rain outside, Daniel said, "You promised you wouldn't leave me." Theodore's front door, his clothes soaked through, and his expression wild with desperation. "You said you cared about me. I do care about you, Daniel." Theodore replied, his voice strained with exhaustion. "But this isn't healthy." You're obsessed, and it's not good for either of us." "I'm not obsessed," Daniel shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "I love you. Why can't you see that?" Theodore tried to reason with him, but it was no use. Daniel wasn't thinking. Rationally, he was starting to lose it. His obsession was warping his perception of reality. He couldn't see that Theodore was trying to protect him and protect both of them from the inevitable disaster that lay ahead. The situation reached its breaking point one fateful evening, just as Theodore had feared it would. Daniel had been sending him messages all day, begging him to meet and talk. But Theodore had ignored them. He knew there was nothing left to say. He couldn't continue living like this, under the constant weight of Daniel. When Theodore arrived home that evening, he found Daniel waiting for him on the front porch. Daniel's eyes were wide and frantic, and he hadn't even bothered to knock. He had simply sat there waiting in the cold. "What are you doing here?" Theodore asked. "We need to talk," Daniel said, standing up and stepping toward him. "You've been ignoring me," Daniel said. "I've been trying to reach you all day, and you've just been what?" "Avoiding me, pretending I don't exist," Theodore sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Daniel, we've talked about this. I can't do this anymore. You need to let go. Let go." Daniel's voice was shrill, almost hysterical. "Let go. I've given everything to you. I love you. How can you just walk away from that?" Theodore stepped back, suddenly aware of the danger in Daniel's eyes. He had seen this kind of intensity before in patients who were teetering on the edge. The edge of control. He'd never thought Daniel capable of violence, but in that moment, he wasn't sure anymore. "Daniel, please." Theodore said, his voice calm but firm. "You need to go. This has gone too far," but Daniel wasn't listening. He lunged at Theodore, his hands grabbing for the older man's shoulders in a desperate attempt to keep him there. The force of the attack caught Theodore off guard, and the two men stumbled back into the house, crashing into the coffee table in the chaos. He felt something sharp under his hand, a letter opener that had been lying on the table. Without thinking, he grabbed it. His instincts kicked in as Daniel tried to wrestle him to the ground. "Stop," he shouted. "Daniel, stop." But Daniel didn't stop. His hands were around Theodore's neck, squeezing tighter. His breath was hot and ragged against Theodore's skin. In that moment, with his vision blurring and his lungs burning, Theodore did the only thing he could think to do. Did he stab Daniel with the letter opener? The blade went deep into his side. Daniel gasped. His grip loosened as he staggered back. His eyes were wide with shock. Blood soaked through his shirt and pooled on the floor beneath him as he collapsed. His body convulsed once before going still. Theodore stood there panting. The letter opener was still clenched in his hand. He was staring down at the lifeless body of the man who had once claimed to love him. He stood there for a long moment. After Daniel's body hit the floor, the world around Theodore Porter seemed to freeze. The air in the room felt thick, and all he could hear was the rapid beating of his own heart. His chest tightened as if the walls of his house were closing in on him, squeezing the breath out of his lungs. He stared at Daniel's blood still pooling from the wound. His youthful face was pale and unmoving. The young man who had once looked at him with so much desire and affection was now Daniel was lying there, lifeless. His eyes were half open, but empty. The sight sent a wave of nausea through Theodore, and the letter opener slipped from his shaking hand, clattering against the floor. What had he done? Theodore's mind raced, scrambling for an answer, for a way to undo what had just happened. But there was no undoing it. He had killed Daniel. The truth of it settled into his bones, heavy and inescapable. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His world, once so orderly and the controlled, ordered world he'd created around him had shattered in an instant, and then came the panic. He had to move, he had to do something. The realization that this was now his reality, that Daniel was dead, and he was responsible, pushed him into motion. His first instinct was to call someone. He grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling as he scrolled through his contacts. But he stopped. Who would he call? Who could he trust? The thought of explaining this to anyone, to the police, to his colleagues, was unbearable. One could know it was an accident. He told himself it hadn't been intentional. He hadn't meant for this to happen. But if anyone found out, they would see him as a murderer. His reputation, his career, everything he had worked for would be destroyed. The small town of Crestwood would never look at him the same way again. Theodore stood over Daniel's body, paralyzed by indecision. He knew he had to clean up the mess. But how? The idea of moving the body filled him with dread. The thought of leaving Daniel there, lifeless on the floor, filled him with dread. He couldn't bear the thought of what he had done. His mind raced through his options. He could call the authorities and tell them it had been self-defense. Daniel had attacked him after all. But Theodore knew how it would look. He was an older man, well respected in the community. Daniel was a young, passionate man who had been obsessed with him. They had been having an affair. Theodore knew that having an affair would come out in the investigation. It would ruin his reputation and basically end his life as he knew it. He couldn't call anyone. He had to take care of this himself. With a shaking breath, Theodore forced himself to move. He grabbed an old tarp from the garage and dragged it into the house. Every step felt heavy. It was like he was moving through quicksand. His body wanted to shut down. It wanted to give in to the horror of the situation. But his mind... He kept pushing himself forward. He had to do this. There was no other choice. He laid the tarp beside Daniel's body. His hands were trembling as he wrapped the young man in it. Daniel's face was covered now, hidden beneath the thick material. But Theodore could still see it in his mind, the lifeless, pale face of a man who had once loved him. The man he had killed. Finally. With Daniel's body hidden in the garage, Theodore collapsed to the floor. His back was against the wall. His body was shaking with exhaustion and fear. He closed his eyes and tried to calm down, but the image of Daniel, his pleading eyes, and the way he had whispered, "I love you," kept playing over and over in his mind. It was haunting him. Tears welled up in Theodore's eyes, surprising him. He hadn't cried in years, not since his divorce, but now the tears came in full force, shaking his body as he sobbed into his hands. He didn't cry just for Daniel, but for himself, for the man he used to be, the man who had once been in control of his life. That man was gone now, replaced by someone he didn't recognize, someone capable of murder. The sound of footsteps jolted Theodore out of his grief. He wiped his tears quickly, his heart pounding as the realization hit him. Someone was coming. For a moment, he thought it might be the police, but no, it was Rachel, his daughter. She had always been protective of her father. Rachel was 25 and a strong, capable woman with the same sharpness and resolve that had made Theodore so successful. She had grown up in the shadow of her father's career, and though they were close, Rachel had always been fiercely independent. Tonight, however, something felt wrong. She hadn't heard from her father in days, and her instincts told her something was off. When Rachel arrived at the house, she immediately noticed the strange stillness. The lights were off, and the door was. Rachel unlocked the door, which was pretty unusual for her meticulous father. She felt anxious as she stepped inside and called out, "Dad." Theodore froze. His heart was racing as he realized that Rachel had entered the house. He tried to calm himself down, but the fear and guilt were overwhelming. There was no way to explain this. What would she think if she saw Daniel's body in the garage? "Dad," Rachel called again, louder this time. Theodore stood up quickly, wiping away the last of his tears. "I'm here." "Rachel," he replied, his voice shaky as he stepped into the hallway. Rachel appeared in the doorway, her brow furrowed in concern. She looked at her father, then at the house. Her instincts were telling her something was wrong. "You're shaking. Are you okay?" Theodore tried to muster a calm expression, but the truth was written all over his face. He couldn't hide it anymore. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice cracking, "I made a terrible mistake." Rachel's eyes widened as she took a step closer. She took a step closer. What do you mean? What happened? Theodore's knees felt weak. He had to tell her there was no point in hiding it anymore. He sank to the floor, unable to meet her gaze. It's Daniel. He's in the garage. I killed him. For a long moment, Rachel didn't say anything. The words hung heavy in the air, sinking into the space between them. Then, without warning, she rushed past Theodore toward the garage. No, Rachel, wait. Theodore called after her. But it was too late. Rachel flung the door open and gasped. Her hands covered her mouth as she took in the sight of Daniel's body, still wrapped in the blood-soaked tarp. Rachel turned to face her father. Her expression was a mixture of shock and horror. What have you done? She whispered. I didn't mean to. Theodore pleaded. He was obsessed. He wouldn't leave me alone. He attacked me, and I stopped. The respected physician in the quiet town of Crestwood was now sitting in stunned silence, his world unraveling before his eyes. He looked regretful and despairing as he silently hoped for some form of understanding or absolution from his daughter. However, in Rachel's eyes, there was no compassion, only disgust, cold and unmistakable. Without a word, Rachel turned away from him and reached for her phone, the weight of her father's crime pressing heavily on her. I'm calling the police, she said, her voice steady despite the tremble in her fingers. Please, Rachel, Theodore rasped, barely above a whisper. Don't do this. It was an accident, but Rachel wasn't swayed. Her mind was made up. She dialed the number with trembling fingers. Her face was pale but resolute as she reported the crime. Theodore crumpled to the floor, utterly defeated. There was no escaping what he had done. His life as he had known it was over. The truth was finally revealed, and it was a cold, undeniable truth. Theodore was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. The trial had captured the attention of the media, and the public was shocked by the extent of his actions. His once respected reputation was shattered, and his name became synonymous with betrayal and violence. Former friends and colleagues distanced themselves, unable to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the man who now sat behind bars. The family he had left behind struggled to cope. To rebuild their lives, they were haunted by the tragedy that had unfolded. The house where Theodore once lived, a place that had been filled with warmth and laughter, stood abandoned. It was a grim reminder of the darkness that had taken root there in the quiet of his prison cell. Theodore faced the weight of his guilt every day. The crime that had destroyed so many lives had also destroyed his own. His downfall became a lasting warning. No secret stays buried forever. When the truth finally emerges, it can tear everything apart.